And we're back. This is the Abstractable Podcast, and you probably already know that because you probably clicked on it anyway. I'm Lockie, and with me, as always, is Ryan. And the Abstractable Podcast, well, today it's somewhere where you can learn a lot about history because we're talking about the book, The Lessons from History, by Will and Ariel Durant.
And for such a concise little book, this one packs a punch. So we talk about the incredible partnership of Will and Ariel Durant's life's work, which is just a mere 50-year series in the story of civilization. We talk about the unchanging biology of humans and how they see society as a rhythmic heartbeat through the ages. So why? To understand how we differ from our ancestors. And I'll leave you with this nice little opening quote. Most history is guessing and the rest is just prejudiced. So you can find out more about the authors. Unfortunately, both have passed away many years ago, but they have written a joint autobiography for us all to indulge in, which you can find online, or you can check out the Will Durant Foundation online as well. Don't forget, with every episode, we do release video for those that aren't already watching it, as well as our audio snippets. So you can find out more about that at our website, abstractable.co. We hope you enjoy. And we're back for another episode. Lockie, do you like that radio announcer intro, mate?
Yeah, that's an exciting start. How's it going?
I'm going well, really well. What's news?
Oh, not too much. I listened to a podcast on the nuclear apocalypse the other day. Potential nuclear apocalypse.
Oh, it sounds a lot more optimistic now that you've said it that way.
Yeah, it's amazing how close we are to, disaster.
To hitting the big red button.
And sort of the way the systems are kind of set up, and that there's been all these times in history where basically the restraint of one general, usually on the Russian side, has prevented all-out nuclear war.
What?
And there's like some, so there's some a couple of times, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a submarine at the bottom of the ocean that was basically out of comms range and thought it was getting attacked and had nukes on board. And two of the approving officers wanted to fire, and by chance the admiral was on that ship, that submarine, and decided that it wasn't the right thing to do.
You are fucking
and all
kidding.
The other ships, and then there was another one where there was a radar issue on the Russian side, and it looked like there were like 500 nuclear warheads heading towards the mainland, and essentially the guy on duty said, look, this can't be right. It must be an error. But if what he should have done is reported it up the chain, and they all would have flown off. So it's not, it's kind of got to do with human error as well as, the systems that are in place that are on hair trigger alert and all these kind of crazy things. So.
Has there been any recent, happenings of this?
Well, it's kind of come back to the surface because Trump was complaining that he why does he have less missiles than, say, Kennedy did, in a bad way, I want
a few more
missiles. And so I think it's kind of brought it all back to the surface, but I think the Doomsday Clock is as far along as it's ever been. So yeah. With that uplifting news, what book are we talking about this week?
Oh, well, I'm sure it's actually probably fitting, mate. It's talking about history today and the lessons from history. So if there's anything to learn from that, don't hit the big red button.
Yeah, otherwise there won't be anything left to write about. So this book was written by Will and the Durants, I suppose you call them.
They were a team. They were a team. Yeah, they were a team, and they're a fierce partnership.
I think probably, it seems from reading the biographies and stuff about them. Will was probably the main historian, I suppose you'd call him, although he had many different parts of his life, but mostly he was a historical academic. But Ariel worked with him, but I'm not sure whether that's just the sexist past or not. But most of the information's based on him, so the biography will be mostly focused on him too.
Well, I don't know, and I guess that's one of the issues of history, mate. We will never know. As I'm sure they appreciate it.
So Will was born in Massachusetts to a French-Canadian Catholic parents, Joseph and Mary, and they'd been part of the Quebec immigration to the United States around about back in the day. I actually missed his birth date here. Apologies to the listener. I'll have to put that in the show notes. But anyhow,
it was very early.
To high school and in 1903 he enrolled in university, so he was born a long time ago. And it was in Jersey City, and basically
he was born in 1885, mate.
Thank you.
There you go, live technology.
Thank God for the internet. Yeah. But his mum wanted him to be a priest, and so did he until he kind of got a bit further along, and essentially he became, after going to university, kind of became an academic and a teacher, and he kind of dabbled. So kind of early 1900s, he was kind of experimenting with some socialism and getting into that sort of thing. But after World War I, he began to recognise that a lust for power underlay all forms of political behaviour, even the ones that seem very altruistic. And then he kind of moved into a period of his life where he taught Latin and French at a few places, one of them being a university in South Orange, New Jersey, Seton Hall University. And he left Seton Hall and was a teacher at the Ferrer Modern School from 1911 to 1913. And at this school, something that would be probably pretty controversial nowadays, he fell in love and married his 15-year-old pupil, who was Ariel. And they had one daughter and had a foster son, Lewis. The daughter was named Ethel, but the foster son was from Ariel's sister, who, for whatever reason, couldn't look after Lewis.
So there's about 10 to 15 years or so between them.
That would get you into a courtroom today. So.
Well, it would. And if you were, even if it was a little bit later on in life, if she was older than 18, let's say, and you were a famous person, it would get you on the headlines.
Yeah, absolutely. But they seem happily married all their life. So, I guess it's a different time.
Plus they had a like a working partnership, which you're about to get into. But it seems that it wasn't just kind of, you didn't hear from Ariel. They had she was involved, and you touched on earlier that there might have been some really sad systematic issues with her not getting enough praise, maybe. But again, you may not ever find out what the real answer was there. So it's great that they were able to have this working partnership. Like, how many people kind of work with their spouses?
I mean, a lot of people in small businesses, I suppose, but it's kind of rarer these days. And you have to be a special kind of couple to do it, I think.
I think that's it, yeah.
So he got his first book published in 1926, And it's called The Story of Philosophy, and it became a bestseller. And this allowed them to be kind of independently wealthy and travel the world. It was that popular. It was originally a lot of small books, and then it was put together and published. And then the journey of their historian life started, where they both wrote an 11 tomes, and they were titled The Story of Civilization as a Whole.
Just a casual undertaking.
And it took a bloody long time, you know. It was kind of like a 50-year thing almost.
Yeah, 5 decades, I think they say.
Yeah.
5 decades of writing all these books about civilization.
Yeah, they wanted to write a biography of civilization, you know. And essentially they seem to kind of work through it, you know, one at a time, very, very methodically. And it gave them this kind of bird's eye view of human race, I guess. But, you know, it was the most successful historiographical series in history. And he received a Pulitzer Prize for Literature for the 10th volume of the work. And after the 10th volume, he wrote a slender volume of observations called The Lessons of History, which we're here to talk about today.
Well, they wrote.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Sorry, they wrote, yeah. And then in 1975, they finished their last one.
Just a casual 50 years later. Unbelievable. And in 1977, mate, they got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So they were recognised at a quite a high level for the undertaking that they went through for this.
Yeah, and in 1981, on October 25th, Ariel died, and 2 weeks later, Will died, and he was 96.
Probably a heartbroken man, or not just a heartbroken man, but he's lost his his artistic and work muse and co-creator.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. So, but yeah, they worked, and they were both pivotal in creating these books, you know.
Yeah, this book too, you know, it was, as you said, it was written some time ago, but it reads really well, even, you know, today. I was able to kind of understand most of the words that were in it. There was a few. Luckily, I was reading it on the Kindle that I was able to look it up.
Nice.
It's not the same for some of the characters that they were talking about. Particularly, you know, like you recognize a lot of these old Greek names, and you know, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and then all the other ones that I can't recall. And you've definitely heard their name, but you don't really know what is their big, you know, contribution to the legacy of philosophy or the legacy of history, or why they were so famous, unless you've really kind of looked into them or been exposed to it maybe in school or something.
So did you go on some of those tangents when you read this?
Well, I had to not get too lost, mate. But again, it's really handy on the Kindle when you kind of highlight some of these, you know, particularly the famous ones. It'll bring up like a little Wikipedia search, and you get just enough of a tidbit to go, they're the ones that was involved in that, or, you know, that was them.
So can you describe the book in a bit more detail of what is this book about, and how does it kind of flow?
Yeah. So it's basically condensing the summary of, as you said, that excessive amount of work that went into writing the 11 volume work that they had. And so in doing that, mate, they've kind of broken this book up into these various different chapters that revolve around what they saw as being the big summations of what describes humanity, I guess. And so no mean feat, but they cover off the earth, biology. So, human and historical relations with biology here, or the Earth's relations with history and humanity here. Race, character, morals, religion, economics, socialism, government, history, growth, and progress. And they basically intertwine all of these different facets of the book. And remember, this is only like 100 pages in length. So
I was going to say that it is incredible how much information and wisdom's the right word, is packed into this book in 100 pages. Imagine how hard it would have been to write this after doing 40 to 50 years of work on these books. And they've sat down and said, look, all right, we're just going to summarize this. Oh, cool. Well, it'll be a 500-pager. Nah, they've got it into 100 pages, and it is so dense in a good way.
Yeah. I mean, you could read it in a few hours if you really wanted to. But to really read it, you probably need as much time as you do to consume probably their 11-part series if you wanted to go the full hog. But it was so full of great stuff and real testament to how well they write, I think. And
it's very readable.
What I love is they basically open up the book with this quote around how subject to prejudice history is. So you see, they just say most history is guessing and the rest of it is prejudice. It's such a great way from these, mammoth historians to open up this book with that. And just to
have you always been interested in history, or is it something that's come along later?
I think I don't know. Do most people have a bit of an interest in history? Like, I think it's kind of something that's in us to some degree, have an interest for the past, like what happened before we were around. I definitely did have a vague interest, but I think it probably stemmed from a close relationship with Age of Empires when I was growing up. And for those that don't know, that is a computer game.
Did you used to do the cheat where you could get the Lamborghinis? You just got hundreds of those.
Mate, you didn't play the game unless you knew those cheats.
God mode.
I think they were Mustangs.
I have to say, I wasn't very interested in history until maybe 5 years ago or something. I always thought it was, I think when I was in school, I thought it was a complete waste of time. Why look at the past, learn about some old generals, who gives a shit. We're living in the now, baby. But obviously that's changed as I've gotten a bit older, and it's just fascinating how modern the problems are that a lot of what you read in history is. That's what fascinates me, I think, about it the most.
I always had an interest, mate, not in recent history. It was like the last 100 years didn't interest me. It was more about things that were 1,000 or 2,000 years old. And maybe that did stem from the old, the Microsoft game collection there. But it was always like so ungraspable, like it was like this was a different species, it was a different person. They weren't human almost, like, because it's just so far-fetched in terms of what it seems like. Yet this book is a huge illumination in that is not the case whatsoever.
No.
And I think we have about something like 3,500 years of recorded history, back from the earliest archives or some recording of some historical stuff going on for humans. I'm not talking here like digging up bones and things. Like, this is actual like captured history.
Yeah.
And reflecting on those 3,500 years, particularly what they're able to draw out, is we haven't really changed too much.
No, we're the same. That's the thing that just is the lesson for me, is that, like, there's a great podcast called Hardcore History with Dan Carlin, and on a road trip, Christy and I listened to the whole series of the fall of the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, and it's scary how relevant it is to today, and how similar. And I guess Dan's gift is that he makes it feel that way, but he's a very excitable lad about history. But these people are experiencing the same things that we do. It's quite fascinating.
He does one on Genghis Khan too.
That would be good.
Yeah, but it feels really dark, like, because he comes up to these moments of just real scary things happening. And you don't quite grasp it either, just how prolific and how bad, I guess, to some degree that he was, particularly like in this book, they compare him to, they put him side by side with Hitler, essentially, which is such a hard thing to grasp for us, particularly just someone that existed eons ago. But he pillaged and destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, absolute monster, it seems. I'll have to listen to that. It'd be very interesting.
But I think the crux of it, mate, was we all come from the same cloth.
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose what we're going to try and do here is really pick out just some interesting things from the book that caught our eye in the form of quotes that we can talk to. And it's such a dense book that we just it would be well worth sitting down and reading. And what we found on the second read, because we read it a few years ago and we've read it again now, is we picked up completely different things and understood things that we didn't last time. And I imagine if we read it in 5 years and then 5 years and then 5 years, you'd kind of have a deeper understanding of a lot of this stuff just through your life experience.
Yeah, I think, mate, just finding out about more of history, finding more about maybe a little bit of ancient Greek history, or the Roman Empire, or just these things that you pick up along the way. And particularly, I think if you come back to it and you've discovered who this Octavius fellow is, and you come back with understanding a little bit more about his life in 5 years' time, you're going to see every time that he's brought up in the book in a completely different way to what you saw it last time, even with the little Wikipedia tidbits.
The other thing I noticed is they've just got a completely zoomed out view, They're looking down from space at us. They've done so much work on learning history that it seems that they're able to completely just look at things very objectively, I thought. And the only other book I've read that feels a bit like this is Sapiens, I think, where it feels like he's studying the human race a little. It feels a little bit that way with this too. Yeah.
I always find reading these type of books, and I think another one is like Thinking Fast and Slow, is there's this, like, I don't want to say pessimism or cynicism, but it's like there are some very dumb elements going on inside. But that is essentially our biology, is what comes out of it. And so that's the reality of it. What do we need to do?
Interesting you mentioned that.
That was a little segue, mate.
Thank you. It's you set it up. So the first section is about biology, and they say the first lesson of history is life is competition. We are acquisitive, greedy, pugnacious. because our blood remembers millenniums through which our forebears had to chase and fight to kill it in order to survive.
Yeah, that's a really nice light on the old human race there, mate.
It feels like, I suppose, that this is a theme that runs throughout the book, is that our biology hasn't changed, you know, and that we are what we are because of, you know, the evolution of being. We're not a very old species, you know. We've evolved socially significantly, but we haven't changed biologically.
Yeah, and even socially, like, have we changed much socially? Is it just technologically that has changed? I guess we act in different ways, but we've come back to, you know, it's kind of gone in cycles as well. You know, the social influence.
I would say we've grown socially in our ability to coordinate in much larger numbers over time.
Yes.
Probably.
Yeah.
But the way that we actually treat each other, probably not so much.
Yeah. Well, apparently that was our separation between the Neanderthals and us, who were a smarter, more physically gifted species, but we had the social ability to separate us. I think that's from the sapiens.
Social game.
The social game, eh?
And on the groups, they say our states, as in our nations, is kind of what they're referring to here. Our states, being ourselves multiplied, are what we are. They write our natures in bolder type and do our good and evil on an elephantine scale. The state has our instincts without our restraints.
Yeah. That's scary, isn't it?
It is. And I've kind of often felt this way, that it seems like there's a different set of rules when you're dealing with country to country than it is when you're dealing with a neighbour or even just, that's probably not a good example, but someone you don't know in a personal sense. It seems in a mob it's a bit more brutal out there.
Yeah.
And much less honest, there's a lot more subterfuge and these kind of things.
Yeah. And I mean, they kind of hit on this a little bit throughout the book in different areas, that, you know, we act in a particular way as an individual person, right? And we have all these characters and traits and things we do, as you just said. And then when you get to the level of, you know, a team and an organization and everything else leading up all the way up to the size of a nation state, that's just that kind of reflected up in terms of just scale. But what kind of happens within the nation is this idea around that the state itself has a monopoly on violence. You know, i.e., it runs the police force, it runs the army, you know, to some degree, and that they are protecting, you know, all the people from external violence coming in. And obviously, from time to time, wars rage, so much so that in the last 3,500 years, I think there's been 268 that have not seen war.
So that was in the book. That blew my mind.
Yeah.
It's kind of surprising, and it isn't it? Like,
it's scary.
It is.
Particularly given that
plenty since this was written.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah, we've had there has been wars raging, certainly in our lifetime. And I think what we're actually finding at the moment is a shift in terms of how wars are raged and what a war actually looks like. You know, there's this idea that's completely shifted the paradigm of what war is now around cyber and cyber war. You know, that's like raging 24/7. There's always cyber attacks going on.
Yeah, there is. It's like the new form of Cold War, I guess.
Is it though? Like, it's kind of like, it's not even that, because the Cold War is like, who's going to hit the button first? Whereas cyber war is just how much can we debilitate? I guess it is. You're like a war of attrition. Is that what you mean from a Cold War perspective?
Well, it's like it's kind of like you're not on the ground, but you're still trying to screw over the enemy.
But I guess,
and you're doing it through sanctions, or you're doing it through spying, or economic restriction, or economic trying to disable things for your enemy, I guess, through these kind of nefarious means. And I think that cyber is a pretty effective way to do that.
It's quite interesting coming off the back of, well, not off the back of, we're still in the mix of it, but COVID, for example, and the fragility of states and reliance on particular, single failure points and different things. Do you think, mate, that there's going to be a lessened impact now on the potential of cyber-related issues? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe they just increase over time, but you certainly can't. It's harder now to maybe lock down a single trade route or debilitate a single organisation that supplies you some critical thing that you need in times of, pestilence, a disease breaking out.
Yeah, I definitely think it's the states will get more robust, but probably not to the point that they need to help them with something like this. And I don't know if I guess that Ariel and Will might disagree with me here, but it feels like we've never cared more about economic prosperity than we have now. So I feel like we won't be able to give up the growth that we seek, and it'll end up kind of centralizing again probably, but time will tell.
That's another positive outlook on what we're up to, mate.
Being honest.
You're a realist, is that right? I think that cyber also has a separate scary element, in that we're on this kind of race for artificial intelligence, or trying to slow down the race for artificial intelligence. But again, you don't know how quickly particular states or particular organisations are actually progressing in this space. And I expect that they are trying to progress that race as fast as possible. It's like the new nuclear arms race, like existed back in World War II. It's just that we haven't got a world war raging, as we speak. It's kind of happening all the time, this development.
And when you see some of those robots they're building that can do backflips and stuff, it's freaky. How long till they strap a biological weapon on one of those and roll it in,
Oh, I think that's already been done.
God damn. Terminator, here we come. That wasn't very positive either, Ryan.
No, I'm
blaming you for that one.
Can you give us some more uplifting content, Lockie?
No, I can't. But let's crack on anyway. So here's another piece of depressing news. Now, essentially, on the matter of states and those sort of things, they say that inequality is not only natural and inborn, it grows with the complexity of civilization. And so that seems to be a truth too. And it would probably be more described in today's terms as like a power law distribution, or something like to do with Pareto. But I think that that's generally what you see in the world if you had a look at it, or even what you see within societies, right?
Do you want to explain what that maybe means, mate?
Damn, we're going to have to try and figure out
it together.
Say something coherent here. So basically, it kind of means it's like the 80-20 rules, where that came from, And basically, in this instance, in civilization, it would be that there's only a small amount of people or states at the top that have all of the, I suppose, wealth or prosperity or power, and that there's a big long tail at the bottom where that everyone else sits. And so you can see these dynamics in a lot of different things in the world around us. But wealth is probably the most commonly known one that's easiest to relate to. And it seems that as things get more complicated, certain types of phenomena follow these patterns. And you'll hear all the time people talk about the 80-20 rule. And that's effectively based off this kind of principle.
Yeah. And
how was that?
Oh, it was good, mate. It was coherent. I followed. But I think there's this inherent layering that we have just in, I see it as like this balance, or the spectrum between, what do they call it? Freedom. And then on the other side is like an orderliness. And you know, the more freedom that we seek, or the more freedom that we are after, means that this inequality kind of begins to reign free more, because there's more chaos in the system. You know, there's more.
Correct.
And particularly when you're talking in this Pareto space of power laws, you know, if someone is, you know, the absolute best at something over time, you know, and with a bit of luck in circumstances, you know, you might end up with the first, you know, being a person that's worth $1 trillion if you're talking on a monetary scale, you know, and we've just had that relatively recently, which is, I imagine back in, you know, 1980s when this book was released, that was unfathomable. I don't even think that they would have even grasped that. So I'd love to see what their take would be now, just on the acceleration and growth of all of this, and maybe they might kind of crank up some of their language a little bit further to the extreme and just say, this is crazy, coupled with technology.
Well, I think that there's some hints in their writing that can kind of tell us what they think about that. But you're right, they take this idea throughout the whole book about, you know, the kind of growing inequalities and then it resetting, you know, and this kind of not only in the economic sense but also in other senses such as you know, population size and things like that as well.
Yeah, and just civilizations themselves. Yeah, it's like a heartbeat. They refer to it as a heartbeat that's kind of like pumping, and it has like a maximum pressure and then the lowest pressure point. And it's kind of just flowing between those two states.
So the second thing they talk about is the second biological lesson of history, that life is selection. And reading this, I felt it was a little bit, it feels very true, but you wouldn't read this kind of writing now, I don't think. I think it would be quite taboo to kind of say these sort of things in this way. Like,
this is why I'm going to let you read out all the quotes from this section, Lockie.
That's a good partner.
Yeah, take one for the team.
You want me to get cancelled? Is that what it is?
Well, that's just it. I think maybe that there is this. We need to bring this into a more positive light, Lockie. But there is that kind of cancel culture that's floating around today, which is basically we see that many people are losing jobs over something they might have said on a social platform, even something that's arguably, it's nothing extreme, if you will. And so that,
I don't think this will be one of the cases of not trying to hype this up before I say this. It's very mild.
It is definitely mild, but in comparison.
I just thought it was interesting to kind of feel your kind of feelings as you're reading something. You're like, oh, this is a bit different.
They were bold. They seem bold, I think is the word. They're bold statements.
Yeah. They didn't care about, they're just trying to tell what they saw, what they've seen in history, you know. So
yeah, and I also think they recognise their bias, mate. They clearly say that, you know, history is full of prejudice and bias, and the fact that they've spent 50 years writing about history probably gives them, you know, arguably quite a lot of credibility in terms of what they do say. And the
I would also argue they're very progressive.
Mm. Well, they were known for being progressive. Which is what earned them, I think, the Presidential Medal for Freedom that they got. And and they were known for their social activism and human rights. I don't know the particular things that they did, but they had some really big hitting human rights movements that they kind of got behind.
So this law, since nature has not read very carefully the American Declaration of Independence or the French Revolutionary Declaration of the Rights of Man, we are all born unequal and unfree, subject to our physical and psychological heredity and to the customs and traditions of our groups. That's quite interesting. I've spent my whole life thinking that there's this, probably until I read Sapiens, that you're just born with these human rights and they're these things that are just like water or something, or gravity. It doesn't really work that way, does it? That's kind of the tradition of our group.
Yeah, it's one of those where you find yourself born type things, you know, it's a privilege type thing, or you know, I guess it's neutral. It's a neutral thing because it doesn't matter where it happens to be. You have some way in which you are brought up based on the tradition of the particular lineage or the group.
This is the follow-on quote from the book. Only the man who is below the average in economic ability desires equality. Those who are conscious of superior ability desire freedom. And in the end, superior ability has its way. That's a pretty tidy summation of certain political philosophies there, Ryan, perhaps.
Tell me more, Lockie.
Well, perhaps it's not... The way I read this is the word economic ability to me seems not, I don't feel like that means like skill. To me, I read that as upward mobility in an economic sense. So that may be because you're not very skillful or motivated, but it might also be because you're downtrodden or somehow discriminated against. There could be many reasons for that. But
you were born into wealth, for example, you know, which is what they speak about in the book as being, you know, that gives you a lot of economic ability.
Yeah. So those kind of areas desire equality, where I think that you look at perhaps there's many different philosophies that have galvanized the less fortunate or the lower, the people who have lower privilege positions. It could be communism, socialism in general, or you could even say Christianity has a bit of that. I think is very popular because of the way that Jesus talked about helping everyone, you know. And then on the flip side, on the back end of that quote, they talk about the superior economic ability people desire freedom. And I think you see a lot of this in the kind of
libertarian.
libertarian. Most libertarians are rich, you know, or you see a lot of it in America at the higher end, and probably some of the more right-wing philosophies in Australia advocate for that, because it's kind of, you know, it kind of makes sense from an incentives point of view from both sides of that equation.
Yeah, but which is arguably a pretty like unempathetic view, you know, because what it doesn't take into consideration is like that, you're going to say it again, but like that equality of opportunity and providing that kind of equality of opportunity in some of these situations. And and so I think they balance this throughout the book, where they talk about on that socialist end of the spectrum, like right down the communist end of the spectrum, their undoing is always this what happens is they move into like a serfdom and a lack of productivity, and they basically people become slaves for the state. And so if they want to maintain existence, they need to move further towards the side of freedom. And then on the other end of the scale, freedom breeds inequality, as you just said. And the more freedom that there is, the less shackles that are provided, you know, the more that things start to turn into, you know, a Wild West, potentially, you know, right up the other end of the scale. And that's not something that you want either. And
it's the yin and the yang of this thing you've got to bring together.
Correct. Yeah. And
if you get too out of balance, generally history has a way of a bloody reset.
which they say happens all the time. Obviously, you know, we've only had a few years or a blink of years in terms of our entire existence that haven't been in that sort of bloody state. And there's also, they say more broadly that nature has three agents, which is, so one of them is war, but then there's another two. One is famine. So this is where, you know, very much that natural selection process where the particular animals who overeat will eventually die off because they, you know, take away all their pastures, or, you know, eat all the insects they're trying to eat, for example. It's no different for humanity. And the other is pestilence, which we've seen a classic example of, or we're still seeing a classic example of at the moment, being COVID.
Yeah.
Just to clarify.
To close off your that was a really nice summation, I think, of the different sides of this thing. But they say utopias of equality are biologically doomed, and the best that the amiable philosopher can hope for is an approximate equality of justice and an equality of educational opportunity. And that's a nice quote, and I think most sane people would agree with that in principle.
Yeah,
this is the equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity kind of discussion.
Yeah, but just kind of throwing in the curveball for you, mate. Like you need to have the extremes though. Like you need to have the radicals, because you need to have the radicals to understand what kind of lies beyond what is now, and particularly to make progress, you know, good progress in a particular direction. You need to understand what kind of how far things can differ from where you maybe are currently, and so you still do need the people that envision a utopia, even though from a practical level, it can't happen. You know, we can never have a perfect market, or you can never have a perfect, you know, a harmoniously running, equal communist society. You know, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like you need these differences of opinion on the sides. And again, it's that tension that comes in from everyone, and you kind of constantly swaying between these two philosophies. And that's a good thing for the society, isn't it? So you need those people on either end. But I think you would agree that the extreme end can be very problematic.
Yeah.
In terms of, as we've seen when some of those people, the extreme of either side get in power, there's been some really bad outcomes for humans over the journey from both the left and the right.
Well, arguably, mate, both paths eventually lead to like dictatorship. It's either dictatorship because of freedom and because of, leverage of economics, or it's down the other end, which ends up being the same thing. They have the complete control over economics, and both end up resulting in some sort of revolt if it's like, not dealt with prior to.
I think you've provided a good segue into your next section, actually, for yourself.
You were meant to provide me the segue. So we've kind of covered it, to some degree. It's just this idea of balance and finding that balance. And a great quote is that nothing is clearer in history than the adoption by successful rebels of the methods they were accustomed to condemn in the forces they deposed. So meaning you have the rebels come in preaching that they want to, overthrow the tyranny, and eventually they start acting in the exact same way. Reminds me of Animal Farm, mate.
Very much episode 3. Oh yeah. And there's so many examples of this. It's scary. Like there's some, like, I think I've mentioned this podcast a few times on this show, but The Dollop is a podcast by these two American comedians, and they tell stories from history, American history mostly. And they often tell stories of these kind of popular movements that have an uprising and gain some sort of, small power in some area. And it can be like a really small community, or it can be on a grand scale. And they follow this exact pattern. It's just, you can kind of set your watch to them turning into the people that they originally got rid of in the first place.
Have you got anything? It
must just be part of human nature.
Have you got anything to wet the palate, mate?
No.
Oh, nothing.
I've forgotten it all.
Okay. It's because you had to jam it full of history instead.
That's it.
Love it.
But you have to check that one out. I mean, I do have one, and it's also a Netflix documentary, Wild Wild Country, I think it's called. And it's about the Rajasthanis and this yoga Osho, this kind of yogi who takes over a small American town, and they set up a new type of community that quickly devolves into an old type of community.
It's like a cult. Good example. Is it a cult?
It's a cult, yeah. You should check that out. Interestingly, Naval quotes that guy quite a lot.
What, the cult leader?
So there's still got some followers, yeah.
Fascinating.
Maybe it's not a cult.
Maybe it's broader than that.
That was the community they had was a cult for sure, but whether his teachings are still relevant and there was a cult built around him, maybe that's a different discussion. But
yeah, there's an inherent.
I'd check that one out.
There's an inherent problem with like a power struggle or something that goes on. I don't know enough about it. You've read the 48 Laws of Power, haven't you?
No, I haven't.
No, I thought you had. So
no, I read the Mastery one. But.
So that's a book I want to read to kind of find out more.
And what world dominance are you planning?
Oh, well, I need to pick one of the 48 first, mate. And then
You'll tell me after you've read it.
And then we'll find out more. Apparently that book was banned in some American prisons or something. Do you know that?
Well, that is great marketing, even if it's not true. It feels
That's
like a holiday
what I was going to say. If you're the author, you would want that propagated, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, let's not get too far off track here, mate. We need to maintain balance. So they actually talk about the character traits of each of us in this, and this kind of falls into this idea of balance around that we can either be like on the positive end or on the negative end. And I don't really think in reading it that the negative end is necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way that these terms are described. And we all kind of fall within a level along this spectrum of some of these positives and negative traits.
It's probably like kinetic versus non-kinetic in a way. Like the negative is sort of a stopping motion, and in a way that's...
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah, think of it like not negative in the sense that it's a bad thing, negative in the sense that it might be a magnet. It's a positive and negative poles rather than good or bad. So there's action versus sleep. There's fight versus flight, acquisition versus avoidance, association versus privacy, mating versus refusal, and parental care versus filial dependence. And
what does filial dependence mean?
Well, the opposite of parental care, meaning that you
don't know.
There's more coming. There is more coming.
Are you Googling?
No, I'm not Googling. I should Google it.
Okay, all right.
But it's like pushing away from like parental care. Okay. So it's not like it's like I literally don't want parental care. You know, it's the rejection of authority almost is what that is.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, quite fascinating. And they describe little like behaviors that each person might have that sits along one of those spectrums, and you can kind of see that things kind of fit quite well. It's very fascinating.
That's cool.
But maybe there's a bit of narrative fallacy falling into that as well, mate. So I need to take care.
I think it's a good model. I like it. There's 1,000 of these kind of things, but you know, it gels with the themes of their book. You know, that's kind of more individual, but they kind of talk about these themes throughout the different sizes of human groups, from the individual all the way up to the nation state.
Well, many people might hear some of those and go, action versus sleep. Well, we don't want to just sleep. Yeah, but you also don't want to be just in action, because there's that old saying, it's
like a shark.
Well,
never stopping.
Well, even worse than that, mate. It's like without rest, growth becomes decay. You know, it actually does the opposite, and so too much action can be a bad thing in that regard.
Yeah.
So, in terms of this book itself, mate, they do touch on a lot about how, as we said earlier, that we specialize in this day and age, and that is a result of that like extra complex system that we've fallen into, or not fallen into, is developed over time. It's like the building of the system that's happened, and obviously, I think that's a testament to this book itself. These guys have been in this game for 5 decades. Right, they've been doing this stuff and focusing on this stuff and they're a partnership. Like, these two have come together. They've spent their lives effectively working in history and also philosophy, and even then, they still say that there's so much that they don't know. And
the more you know you don't know.
And it comes into this interesting space of this specialization versus generalist mentality. And it's kind of like, which way do you go? And I think, again, it just comes down to maybe that balance. But arguably, according to what they were talking about, is with the specialization leads to the ability to gather wealth. And not just talking economic wealth here, but just general wealth and wealth around a particular topic. But maybe in boost for the generalists there, there's probably wealth that generalists gather that specialists don't gather.
It seems to be a smart individual move to move towards specialization at some point. It's more of a wild card to be too general, I think. So I think that on the whole, people move towards specialization, and
that's interesting.
And
do you think it's safer
over time?
So do you think it's like safer? It's more secure? Is that
Definitely.
What it is?
But only in the maybe not. It may not be as robust, but it's probably in the moment a bit safer.
It feels more secure.
It's a complicated question, actually. I'm not sure I fully know. I'll have a think about it and get back to you.
Come back to us. So yeah, that was. But the point being is, there's this balance that exists between all those different things, and even in the sense of governments, and we were talking about before, these governments on both polarizing ends of the scale of the spectrum. Eventually they lead into this space of becoming what they despised at the beginning. And so it's just, with either path of trying to, even for the path that's trying to seek equality, right? And seek things being more equal, which is that more left communist perspective, for example. Even that over time eventually breeds to the inflections in the system, and it just slows down that inequality. So then it's like an inevitability that we know we need to face and seek a balance. And almost coming off the back of it, mate, one of the big things they mention is about this idea that we don't need to have revolutions in order to enact, to kind of shift the balance back. The revolutions occur when the egos flare up on both sides, of the argument. And, they spoke about, I think it was some of the aristocrats back in ancient Greece, and they kind of arced up and didn't, even more so, they would prefer to just throw their money into the ocean than distribute their money out. And that's that's a really broken mentality. And then eventually on the other side, what actually happens is the other side seeking or the ones starting the revolt, they would rather see the money taken from the aristocrats than come across some treasures themselves,
Yeah,
and they say that
it's so polarized. It's not really about the point anymore, is it? It's like mimetic. But there's kind of like two choices, it seems. You can solve something by talking to one another, or you can have a fight. In its simplest form, it feels like they're the two options.
But they say
sometimes it gets to the point where you can't stand to talk to the other person anymore. It's gone beyond it. But there's ways of peaceful redistribution for sure, and that's a balanced system. I mean, tax is a good example of that.
Yeah, that's exactly what they say. And they say that the revolt actually ends up destroying like the overall collective wealth as a result. Whereas you can have generation, like overall wealth generation within the community or within the state, for example, if you go down the path of the more peaceful, negotiated approach. I think the challenge is it just doesn't feel as nice sometimes. There's that egotistical or the pride aspect, or even like an impatience to some degree. We want action now type thing. So it's a tough, complex game to play, mate.
It happens over and over again, according to these guys.
But
it's like you said, it's that heartbeat.
It is. But in all of these things, I was going to say, mate, in all of these things, we are making progress. We are moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. It's all, not everything gets destroyed in these things. Human lives do, but the cumulative knowledge of humanity seems to be consistently increasing, and our ability to pass the knowledge on through systems mainly seems to be getting better and better over time, which may end up leading to our doom, but it certainly makes our lives comfortable.
Yeah, it does. I think there is a classic question now. You need to kind of control a few pieces of this question. But it's like, would you prefer to be born an aristocrat 2,000 years ago or whatever, 1,000 years ago? Or would you prefer to be born poor today? And I think the reality is you probably prefer to be born poor today because, your life expectancy is still double or more that of the aristocrat. You're likely to live a much more healthier life, even without lots of financial means. Now, obviously, there's some stark issues.
This is on average.
On average, yeah, on average. Let's be careful to put that in.
It goes, but it kind of You've got two views here, like, and to finish the previous point, go back a couple of steps. I mean, one of their key things that they say is that the concentration of wealth is a natural phenomenon and an inevitable phenomenon. So the wealth ascends to that aristocracy in every civilization ever. It just happens. It's how that gets fed back into everyone else that makes the difference in the fate of that from a civilization within the four walls perspective. But then if you zoom out further, which is what you're kind of talking about now, is that accumulation of knowledge and ability to produce things and to share, and these social systems that we have grows the whole pie over time, so that and that is such a powerful force. It's way more powerful than that accumulation of wealth in the moment, because that means that you're actually better off potentially on average being someone who's at the bottom of that distribution and poor than the person who's accumulated the concentration of wealth a few centuries ago.
Yeah, it's like you have a much higher chance of, living beyond the age of 4 or 5 years old is probably one of the big ones, right? Like
that's so true. That's a great point.
Yeah, because even the aristocrats were plagued by, they had all the financial means in the world. They had all the slaves, or even if they were being paid, not very much, workers helping them, and the best access to health, etc. But they still had miscarriages after miscarriages, or death after death. In terms of, I think it was very much a hit or miss thing for a woman to get pregnant as to whether she was going to survive herself, let alone the baby.
Well, that's right. Let alone the baby, exactly.
Which is terrible, whereas
terrifying.
now it is absolutely terrifying. And can you imagine going into that? You can't even, it's like, I don't want to continue the lineage on,
It comes, exactly. It comes back to that quote from one of our episodes. They say the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. So you could still find places where that's the case in the world. And I was thinking, as you were saying that back in the aristocratic age, you still had sewage in the streets flowing down the gutters, and a city was a very unpleasant place to be. That still happens all over the world now. It's just I don't see it walking down in Melbourne. But you would have to say, even with allowing for that effect, we're still in a much better position than we were. I mean, famine is almost something that we've, for the moment, can't say forever because Nassim will get on the phone, but that we've kind of dealt with it.
He had to have a mention throughout the episode, so well done.
At least we're on track to dealing with famine almost. Yeah, the amount of food we're now producing.
I think yes, I think progress is without a doubt real in that sense, and I guess where the sticking point comes, where the real challenge comes, is you see. I've heard stories in, say, developing countries where people are struggling to put food on the table, afford their next meal, yet they have access to an iPhone with Facebook and are able to spend their time on that Facebook and spend their money buying phone credit to do this. And so I see that as the problem, or a problem in the system, is if someone has access to that credit and the ability to spend a lot of time on, say, Facebook or something like that, because they're very, at the end of the day, they're just as addictive for you or me as they are for anyone else in the world. I see that as being the challenge that needs to be solved. And, if someone has access to those things, I would hope that they would have access to food before being able to, kind of skip that level, if that makes sense. It's like you've skipped some of the more basic needs, and through no necessarily fault of their own. It's just the intervention maybe isn't there that should be there.
Yeah, some of it's got to do with the system of the society that you're living in.
That's it.
That's cooperation.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
So we better wrap this up in a sec.
Oh, we better, mate. It's probably getting very late.
Yammering on for almost a couple of hours.
I think we've kind of danced around it, right? But there's this, to kind of summarize that whole piece there, is we've moved beyond just telling stories to our children, because that was the going back. And even, still is a thing. But we've just added other things on top. So now we have writing, so now we write to pass information on. Whereas now in society, we have organisations that arguably stand the test of time, nation states that stand the test of time, or stand a longer test of time than just one generation. And
well, it seems that a city is more sustainable than a nation in many senses.
Well, that's also
swap
true.
The flag over.
Swap allegiances.
Extremely resilient.
Yeah, and so the city or the state or whatever it is, that becomes, and also any of the other organisations and institutions, educational institutions are a massive part here, is they are kind of the everlasting, arguably, things that enable people to get from zero, because everyone starts at nothing. every single person born doesn't have any knowledge of this stuff. They don't have any knowledge of culture. It's something that's learned, and knowledge of civilization. It's learned over time, and that's kind of the place that we differentiate from past centuries and millennia, is that there's these things or these growing number of things that enable that transmission of information.
Yeah, the link can't be broken. If it is, we're back in the Stone Ages.
Well, maybe as we transition to more of a paperless society, mate, there might be an EMP that wipes out all of our databases, and we'll lose everything, and we'll forget how we do things.
Or if just Jeff Bezos unplugs it.
Oh, hell that.
Most of it's stored on Amazon servers, isn't it?
I think so. All the AWS stuff, or our book supply.
Yeah, it would affect this podcast.
So, mate, I'm going to ask you the question because we haven't asked it in many episodes. Is this book a blue pill or a red pill?
Well, can you tell the listener what that actually means? Because it's only going to be the hardcore fan that remembers this one.
So is this for the fan or is this for you, mate? Because I'd forgotten.
Yeah, look, I think I remember which is which, but I'm a little bit testy, so I might need you to remind me.
So this is a reference from The Matrix, and we've only brought it up we've probably only brought it up in the episodes that get the right pill. So this is a red pill because whilst the whole maybe book shines a slightly more negative.
What does a red pill mean?
So the red pill, I was getting to that.
But you got to explain it before you give your answer.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So the blue pill or the red pill, you can choose my left hand or my right hand, and I don't know which one's in which hand. And this is Morpheus asking Neo which pill he'd like to take. And so by taking the red pill, let's start with the blue pill. By taking the blue pill, he will wake up the next day and resume his, blissful life of ignorance, versus which for Neo wasn't that great. I don't think he enjoyed the cubicle job he had. And so then on the other side is the red pill, and the red pill, whilst illuminates and reveals some of the information and the realism of the world, which can have some very scary or stark consequences. From a mental overloading, you're better off seeing that. It's like, yeah,
you open your eyes to a new world.
So it's almost like in the succinct version, blue pill is like ignorance is bliss, and red pill is see what really happens. But
this is definitely a red pill.
Definitely a red pill. Do you want to read the ending quote, Lockie? Which actually also happens.
I'd love to.
Actually happens to be I think the final paragraph in the book. It's very fitting for a final quote.
If a man is fortunate, he will, before he dies, gather up as much as he can of his civilized heritage and transmit it to his children. And to his final breath, he will be grateful for this inexhaustible legacy, knowing that it is our nourishing mother and our lasting life. It's good. It's good, isn't it?
Pretty powerful one, mate. Eh?
It is. It is.
I don't think you need to have kids though. I think that's a literal interpretation. I think there's a bit more than that. But we'll leave that to the audience to figure out.
Thanks, mate.
Good chatting.
Cheers.